Hi, I'm JD Sleep from General Guitar Gadgets. Welcome to Adventures in Routing, Episode 1. Today we're going to have a general overview of routers and switch boxes that are on the site at generalguitargadgets.com. So we're going to just take a look at some of the things available and the diagrams and some of the ideas that you can use. We believe that routing is can be a very fun and useful thing to have and to know about, and very useful for your sound. So let's take a look at some of the routing boxes that we have. Okay, so here's our first routing box. It's a AB switch. I'm sure most of you probably know how an AB switch works. You have an input, and so you can plug your guitar into here, have two outputs where it could go to two different amps or possibly two different parts of your pedal board. Or you could have two guitars coming in here. They do say out and in, but it shouldn't really be labeled that because these could be inputs with one output. And then you would switch which input you want to have going to the output. Very simple and a very useful box. We have made sure that our AB box, when you switch, if I was to switch, say I had a guitar in with two outputs and I was to switch to output 1, we have switched output 2 to ground, and we found that that's a pretty important aspect to an AB switch. If you have high gain pedals or high gain amps, there's a possibility that not having that unused channel would cause a pretty good amount of noise or buzz to start happening. So that's something you'll notice in the diagrams, and you should follow the diagrams and ground that unused one. So if it's switched on to this one, it will ground the unused output. If you switch it to here, it switches the ground to this unused output. Okay, so that's AB box. Next up, in simplicity, is the ABY, and it's exactly like the AB box, except it has an extra switch where you can switch them both on at the same time. And we have chosen to have 3 of the LEDs indicators. And so if you were to switch the AB box into the Y mode, let me just try to get something so you can see the lights better. Hopefully you can see that. If you were to switch into AB, which it is right now you're, let's just say we have one input going in and two outputs. This one, I was smart enough not to label anything with input or output. And when you see the C, I don't know if you can see that, but the C would indicate not ABC, but common. So you have your, if this was an input, the common, or one common output, if you had two inputs. But what I was saying about the LEDs is that if you did switch into Y mode, we have 3 LEDs so that when you switch back out of Y mode, you'll know whether you're switching back to just the single A or the single B. If assuming this is A, B into an output, which is what I mostly use these for. Otherwise, you're going to be just using guitars, and there might be situations where you have wanted to have A and B, a Y with guitar inputs, but it's probably more likely that you'd be using them as outputs. So that's our ABY box. The next up in complexity, I suppose you would say, is an ABY box exactly the same as the passive ABY. By the way, the first 2 boxes were passive, and which means you don't need power to run them. They do have power for the LED indicators, but the actual signals is all passive. Now this is the first one that's not passive, and it has buffers on the AB outputs. Now when you put those buffers in there, you can no longer use the AB as inputs, they can only be outputs. since the buffer, the active circuit, only works one way. So otherwise, exactly the same box. The buffered outputs are extremely useful in some situations, because especially if you're in the Y mode, the B and B at the same time, you're splitting the signal, and so the buffer will get your signal back up to as if it wasn't splitted, or better. So and you can add buffers to AB, ABY, or just about anything that splits, any kind of router that splits. So let's take a look at some of the other splitting options. By the way, with the buffered output for this one, it has one board. We have a dual buffer PCB or kit, and you can just install that little kit inside here. Next up, this is a four-way splitter. One input and four outputs, and we used two of the dual buffer boards, so there's four buffers. It splits the signal four ways. Each one is buffered, and each one is very clean and nice sounding, and it's as if they weren't split at all when you put the buffer on there. So you can get four really good clean outputs from one input. And what you would use that for, probably, or one example anyway, is to use it with the mini mixer, and or some kind of a mixer. So you would have your guitar in, four outputs out, going to different, probably to different effects or something like that. You could split it and just go into four different amps. If you wanted to mix them back into one output to go into one amp, then you would use some kind of mixer like this, and then you could put your effects between the two and then mix in whatever effect you want. So you could use volume pedals and just keep these at the same level, and use volume pedals to mix things in and out, as I've seen Steve Morris do that. I don't know if his rig if he still does that with his rig, but he used to just use volume pedals instead of switching effects in. He would bring them in with volume pedals. Okay, next up is the effects loop. This is simply all it is just a bypass switching box, sometimes what they call. You put your guitar and amp into there as normal, and then on the side you plug in like a loop send and a loop return, loop out and loop in, and then anything in that loop can be true bypassed with just flicking the switch. Now this is really good for if you have multiple effects that you want to switch on all at the same time, or if you have an old vintage pedal that you wanted to switch in and out, that it's not true bypass, and you wanted to make it true bypass, you could use this pedal to completely bypass it and have a good clean bypass on it. So from here, what we could do next is a dual loop, and it's the same thing, a similar thing. Plug your guitar and amp in, and then you can have a loop here and a loop here, two loops coming out of it. And this one, it just will switch back and forth between loop A and B. So I don't know if you can see the label very well, but when you switch it, it just switches back and forth between loop A and B, and those are gives you the possibility to run two completely different sets of effects. It may not be so useful because it doesn't have a bypass, and so the next step would be same thing. This is the same exact thing, dual effects loop, but this one here gives you the bypass, so you can run bypass or either loop on it. And so the actually this is the bypass on this side. Everything's bypassed if this is on, you got your loops on. Now it's all bypassed. So if that's on, and then you can switch between either one of the two loops. Now there's more possibilities you can do with the loop, and the next thing up would be something like this, and it is just another dual loop with the same thing, bypass and loop select. But I've added passive volume control at the end of each loop. Now we can put an active volume control in there, and we will soon have a dual booster board where we could do active and give you a boost in volume. This one happens to be just passive. I had a couple of Stompboxes that had no volume control on them, and they were a little bit too loud, so I put the passive volumes on it so I could control those Stompboxes. And it may not be useful in a lot of situations. It probably would be more useful to have the active volume boost if that's something you want to do. Next up is something that was originated in, originally I saw it in Craig Anderton's book, Do-It-Yourself Projects for Guitarists, and it is an effects order switcher. You would plug it in the similar way that you did the dual loops, and then you have the possibility to change the order of the effects that are on. So if you had things plugged in, you would have say you had a delay and a distortion. The delay was A and the distortion was B. This one would be giving you the distortion into the delay. Simple flick of the switch, and now the delay is into the distortion. So it could be some people have a quandary about compressors, whether it should be at the beginning of the signal chain or at the end, and this could be a solution if you have certain situations where you want it at the beginning of your effects chain or at the end. And so that's that. We also have something that's sort of similar. It's called a translocator. I saw this online, and I asked the guy that designed it if we could put it on our site, and he graciously agreed. It is basically an effects order switcher, but it has a lot of different uses. You can use it for basically what's neat about it is it shows you what you can do with one of the dual loop pedals. Or if you hook it up, you can use it for an effects order switcher, depending on how you hook things up. But anyway, the user's manual for this can give you an idea of how to use any of these Stompboxes. The one thing that I should mention back again when I was talking about the unused loops being grounded, I was talking about it during the AB when I was talking about the ABs, but this one does not ground the unused loops, and it can cause trouble. When we designed the difference between this and the dual loop, there's very little difference between it, but with the dual loop we did make sure that the unused input was grounded, and so by doing that we gave up a little bit of the function of the translocator, but you really can get some noise problems with high gains pedals if you don't, and possibly with going into certain amps if you don't ground that unused loop when it's switched over. And I've seen this firsthand, personal experience. It solves the problem in a lot of cases with noise from high gain pedals. So it's very important that we ground that unused loop or channel on an AB, and we made sure that all of these boxes do that to the best we can. And I also wanted to show you one more thing. It's called a micro mixer, and it's from an old book I got from Radio Shack years and years ago. A very simple one transistor JFET mixer, and it is an awesome little mixer pedal. Very clean and transparent. And if you wanted something with just would work very, very well in combination with the ABY, if you wanted to do a very simple mixing of two channels. Very, very nice, and transparent and clean. And we will, in the next episode, we'll show a demo of how to do this with the ABYs. So that's an overview of the routing boxes on GeneralGuitarGadgets.com website. Hope you've enjoyed it, and stay tuned for episode 2. Thanks.